Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, into a very special episode of the Johnny's Report as we are here on this Thursday evening, October the 23rd, back from Big East Media Day. Here's some of the nuggets we caught and much more from Madison Square Garden. It was a banner day. It was a historical day for the St. John's basketball team as your Red Storm topped the Big East preseason coaches poll for the first time since the 1991 season, which was Louis Carnesecca's final season as head coach of St. John's. It's something that I think you take with great pride, but it's something you also take with kind of a grain of salt. We really don't. We look at the Big East preseason coaches poll rankings before the year, but kind of once the season starts, it all goes out the window. And really, when you get into Big East conference play, it really goes out of the window because at that point, that's when it's for real. For St. John's, though, it feels good as a fan, of course, to be recognized and to have this team be recognized by the coaches of the Big East. But at the same time, you look at the last 2 years for St. John's, they were pegged to finish fifth in Rick Pitino's first year in the 23-24 season, and last year they were expected to finish fifth in the coaches poll, finishing behind Xavier, Marquette, Creighton, and UConn. In the 23-24 season, Villanova was expected to finish ahead of St. John's, and all of that, of course, didn't happen. Of course, last year, St. John's goes on to win the Big East tournament. They were regular season Big East champs. So, like I said, you take it with a grain of salt at times. It's great to have that as like a mark and to notice that, okay, we're going to have the eyes of not only the nation on our backs, but also the conference as well. And it's kind of interesting because when you look at the Ken Palm, UConn's picked to finish higher than St. John's, 10 slots higher. They are in the AP top 25. UConn is one spot ahead of St. John's. They're fourth. St. John's will open the year fifth. So when you consider all that, it's interesting that in the coaches poll, they put St. John's 1, UConn 2. So that's something to note as well. But without further ado, let's get to an interview we had, an all-access interview with St. John's guard and transfer portal addition, Oziyah Sellers.
Jay Hollihan here for Big East Energy, here with St. John's guard, Oziyah Sellers. Oziyah, what was your first taste what was your first Rick Pitino moment in the summer?
First day of practice. I mean, he was right to it. First day of practice. Coaching us, holding us accountable. So I feel like that was definitely my first taste, and I loved it.
So, with this being your first time, obviously, New York school, how do you feel about playing in the big city now, coming over from the West Coast?
Yeah, it's definitely a big change. My first time in New York was this summer. But I mean, I'm excited for it. At the end of the day, it's just basketball. The game doesn't change, so it's the same game that I've known since I was a kid, and I'm ready to just go out there and play it.
And coming over, with all the expectations that you have this year, has that kind of been a point of emphasis to just kind of settle down, not really think about anything as you're going into the season?
For sure. I mean, Coach preaches that every day to just take it a day at a time, and just focus on what we have at that time. So what that is now is just practice later today, and then, obviously preparing for our game this weekend.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
We appreciate Oziyah taking the time. Obviously, this is going to be a challenge for St. John's from the get-go, I think, to be able to build this chemistry. We saw it 2 years ago. It took a little bit of time. I mean, if you remember that first Madison Square Garden game against Michigan, that was a tough watch because about midway through the first half, you kind of knew, all right, this isn't going to be St. John's night. Michigan's not expected to do that well. And as it turned out, Michigan did not have that great of a season. And St. John's, of course, learned a lot from that game. So we'll see when St. John's goes up against Alabama how this is all going to look. But I'm curious to see how Oziyah plays specifically. As you heard me talk to him there, he's coming over from Stanford. He was a tremendous player for the Stanford Cardinals. And for St. John's, he's a California kid coming into the big city. How is that going to look? The last 3 years, last year was his best season where he averaged 14 points per game, shot 40% from beyond, 45% from the field. The year before, he didn't get a ton of minutes. His minutes went up by 19. He had 33 last year, had only 14 in the 23-24 season where he averaged 5 points per game, shot 43% from beyond and 47% from the field. I'm curious to see, going from a team in Stanford where you have pretty low expectations to now jumping up in the Big East to where the expectations are going to be through the roof in New York City. Curious to see how this is going to look, but I'm excited at the same time to see how it plays for St. John's. We know he's talented. We know he's got that ability to be able to shoot from beyond, and we'll see how the senior does at St. John's and at how he will be able to take on the expectations of this team, take on the expectations in the media. And, when you come over from, Stanford and he was at USC before, then that's where, he wasn't getting the amount of minutes that he probably would have liked. I'm curious, the California media, college basketball out there, I always get the sense that it's not as big of a deal on the West Coast as it is on the East Coast, obviously. So that's why I kind of asked him, what do you envision this looking like for yourself? And also asking him there about playing for a coach like Rick Pitino, who, of course, can be a bit intimidating, as we well know. All right, now we had a brief conversation with Rick Pitino. Wanted to pick his brain on being a head coach in the Big East for so long. What would you describe the Big East, a Big East basketball game, to someone who has never seen it before?
Well, it depends who you're playing.
For me, I feel like it's been good.
Big East backcourt players are tough, hard-nosed guys to get after you. It's a defensive, hard-nosed league. Always been that way. It started with Big John at Georgetown and filtered down to the rest of the teams.
Well, I'll tell you what, for myself, obviously it wasn't the first time I got to see a Big East basketball game, but one really up close behind the basket about 2 rows back in January of 2021 when St. John's hosted Seton Hall, and St. John's got dominated on the glass that day by Hall. And it kind of, when you get a firsthand experience from it and that close, you realize, dang, things get pretty rough and tough in the post in the Big East. And that's something that is in the current Big East that the fan today would say, the older fan would say, yeah, it probably looks real rough and tough and beating and banging. Nothing compared to back in the day. And that's why, of course, went ahead and asked Rick Pitino that question as well. But Rick made a few interesting comments. I mean, he's going to be someone in the media, always stirring the pot a little bit and telling it like it is probably the best way to describe it. But he spoke about his contract situation. And, he in his time at St. John's has always had to answer the question of, how long do you think you're going to continue coaching? Obviously, his age is something that's always brought up. He would turn 73 this past September. And, he kind of mentioned that he's not sure how much time he's really going to have left as a head coach at St. John's. And it kind of makes you wonder, is there kind of a conversation behind the scenes being had between Rick Pitino and the higher-ups with Ed Cool, with Father Brian Shanley, President Father Brian Shanley, where they're talking about contract situations. Rick signed a 6-year deal back in 2023 where he gets paid $20 million, 3.3 annually. Now, Ed Cool went on record in an article published by the New York Post, and he said he's going to do whatever it takes to keep Rick Pitino, the head man at St. John's, for as long as he wants. Me, personally, 3.3 annually, I kind of think Rick's really looking for a little more cash, a little more dough. I'm telling you, give him whatever he wants, okay? The last 2 seasons have been, and I guess really when we talk about the 23-24 season, we really had a lot of fun at the back end of that year. But still, the basketball St. John's was playing, I think overall, we'd say, looked a lot better than what we had the previous 20 years consistently. And last year, of course, was the best season in decades for St. John's. Give him whatever he wants. We're bringing in portal players. We're a national story. Won the Big East last year. St. John's is no longer a joke. They're no longer the laughingstock of the Big East, no longer the afterthought. He's brought this university back on the map. The sellouts they had last year at Madison Square Garden was unfathomable, to be honest. But, years prior, I don't think we were expecting that. We always kind of dreamed that it could happen, but, necessarily, I even think when Rick Pitino came aboard, in your wildest dreams, you thought it would happen, but, you knew it was going to be a tough hill to climb in order to be able to get sellouts at Madison Square Garden. And we heard Rick Pitino say at St. John's Media Day where, he kind of mentioned, listen, we're not expecting to sell out games early, but I anticipate that to be the case. Hopefully, when we get into Big East play, and St. John's hopefully will be a name that fans will want to come out and watch a game. And that's why I say, hey, you know what? With that being the case, give him the money. Give him whatever he wants. I mean, come on. Like, we are now breaking ground on a $60 million arena that's going to be sitting in the Belson Stadium parking lot. The hope there is that obviously they're going to continue to generate more and more revenue, a much nicer basketball arena. If it looks anything like the KFC Yum Center in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, which I don't expect it to come near to looking like that, but to going from with what we have at Carnesec Arena, and I know it's a historical arena. Someone was saying that to me the other day, oh, that's a shame. It's a historical arena. Listen, you attend a game in there. The acoustics aren't great. It's pretty outdated. It can only hold 5,000 capacity. It's time. St. John's needs to get caught up with the times. I'm not saying you need to go to a 20,000, seat arena, but could you at least maybe get to 10, at the very least a little lower than 10? I mean, come on. What are we doing here? That's something that I'd like to see for St. John's. And with that being said, the fact that you're bringing in all these people, the fact that all this is being had and St. John's back on the market, give the man what he wants. So I'll hop off my soapbox on that. Now, some awards that were handed out or preseason awards that were handed out. Zuby Ejiofor named Big East Preseason Player of the Year, first player to do that or be named to that honor since Shamori Pons. Obviously a big deal for St. John's and a big deal for Zuby. Seeing Zuby walk around, on the floor there, man, he looks in great shape coming into this season. I mean, it kind of reminds me of how Joel Soriano looked when he was entering into his first season under Rick Pitino back in 2023. He just, I mean, really, really looked good. And I thought, man, he from his first year back in the 22-23 season or 21-22 season to his final year 23-24. It's kind of how I look at Zuby right now. A guy that looks really, really in shape, looks like a guy that possibly could give you 32 minutes a game. And for what they're envisioning for him this upcoming season, where, he's probably going to be a guy that's going to play more out on the perimeter. I'm going to expect him to obviously be in great shape. And I know he did that at times last year, but I don't expect him to really be down low a lot. And that's something that I think will, with his frame now looking the way it is, that has to be the mindset of, hey, we got to get him lean. We got to get him more in shape. Not that he wasn't, but just more in shape to be able to handle on the outside. Now, Zuby was also named as an All Big East preseason first team honors. Him, along with Bryce Hopkins, were named to that coveted list. And that's a big deal, of course, for St. John's. Joining them was Solo Ball, Alex Caraban, and Terrace Reed Jr. of UConn, and Owen Freeman from Creighton, as well as Chase Ross from Marquette. And, I mean, Alex Caraban, my goodness, how many years, It's going on year 6 here in the Big East, so that's to be expected. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how Bryce Hopkins plays, returning from injury. I think Rick Pitino has answered enough questions about his comments back on a couple weeks ago at St. John's Media Day. We played it for you about, how he wants him to play, how he wants his players to play, and use it as a motivational tool for Bryce. And I think, and I hope Bryce got the message, and we'll see Bryce Hopkins take his game to another level. And we'll get a good chance to see that this Saturday as St. John's will take on Michigan in their final scrimmage before they welcome in Quinnipiac on November 3rd for the first game of the year. So 5 things to know about the Michigan Wolverines. Starting off, in case you don't know, their head coach is Dusty May, formerly at Florida Atlantic for 6 seasons. He has made the NCAA tournament in his last 3 straight years. He led FAU to the Final Four in 2023, an FAU team that just came out of nowhere that season and really had obviously a strong tournament. They were upsetting teams left and right. Cinderella story, the darling of the tournament that year. But for Dusty May, that of course took his career on a accelerated path because 2 years later, he's trying to build back up Michigan, a place that I think a lot of people felt, man, this program has fallen on some tough times over the last couple of years. They are far away from being the runner-ups they were back in 2018, losing to Villanova. But Dusty May in year 1, my goodness, I mean, what a job he did at Michigan last year. It was interesting because kind of going through their team last year, they really weren't a team that shot tremendously well, shot better than St. John's, but I kind of expected the numbers to look perhaps a little bit better. However, they were one of the best teams in the country last year in rebounding. Danny Wolf led the team in that category with 9 boards per game. He's now on the Brooklyn Nets. They were also one of the top teams in assists. That was Trey Donaldson, who led the way with 4. Trey Donaldson was a player last year I spoke about. I thought he was going to have such a bigger impact in the tournament. I thought he could lead Michigan on a big run. And they did go pretty far for a head coach in his first season. Made it to the second weekend. But I kind of thought they would do perhaps a little bit better with that being said, and maybe even get to the Elite 8, to the potential Final Four. But regardless, a great year for him. Now, another thing you need to know, and this is a real blast from the past. Yaxel Landenborg, the former St. John's commit back when Mike Anderson was the head coach of the team in the 22-23 season. Yaxel was a JUCO player committed to St. John's, I believe pretty much midway through the 22-23 season. And once Rick Pitino took over, a lot of guys that were committed, I mean, we saw the overshift in the St. John's team, and Yaxel was not part of the players that were going to be heading up St. John's and Rick Pitino as they were rebuilding the program. Instead, he went over to UAB. I'm not sure if he had any, I'm just going to kind of throw this out there. I'm not sure if he had any influence on it, but Mike Anderson, obviously being the former coach at UAB, I don't know if he was able to give Yaxel kind of a, shall we say, a call and say, hey, you know, I got this guy, good kid, blah, blah, blah. And Yaxel was over at University of Alabama, Birmingham. May or may not have been the case. I always thought that could have been a connection there. But he's one of the top players in the transfer portal coming over from University of Alabama, Birmingham, going to Michigan. So we'll get a good look at him Saturday and what maybe St. John's could have had. But I think we're all pretty happy with Zuby Ejiofor. So I don't think there's a lot of love lost. Worked out for Yaxel, obviously worked out for St. John's. Oscar Goodman, another player to look out. Member of the 2025 New Zealand national team, chose Michigan over schools like Georgetown, Texas Tech, and Ohio State. So obviously Michigan got one over on them. And then they're also welcoming a 5-star recruit, Trey McKinney, McDonald's All-American, one of the top players in the country and someone to certainly look out for on the Michigan Wolverines for this upcoming season. So those are your 5 things to know for the Michigan Wolverines. Now, one final comment that St. John's head coach Rick Pitino made was about his son, Richard Pitino, and the Xavier Musketeers. This was something that on the surface caught a lot of people's attention, but when, you know, the layers are kind of peeled back and you kind of saw what he meant, it's kind of like, okay, well, that's an obvious statement. So Rick said that he expects Richard to pretty much struggle in his first season at Xavier. He's bringing over 13 kids, or bringing in 13 kids, complete roster overhaul. Expects it to be a bit of a struggle in the Big East. Expect Xavier to probably be middle of the pack. I think we're all anticipating, if the conference, which Rick Pitino also said at St. John's Media Day, he expects to be much better than last year talent-wise. If that is indeed the case, you know, maybe Xavier could be a team, hey, they catch fire towards the end of the season. Maybe they end up making the tournament in Richard's first year. But Rick believes that it's going to be tough for the Musketeers to get off and running. And, of course, head coach Richard Pitino was asked plenty of times, and he will, of course, continue to be asked, of course, throughout the season about, you know, being maybe a little overshadowed, being in the same conference as his father. And, of course, they will be going head-to-head at the end of January and in early February when St. John's takes on Xavier. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us on this episode of the Johnny's Report. We thank you for tuning in. We will have much more coverage to come for St. John's basketball. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you next time.